Welcome back, woodworkers. Alright, so talking about veneering and applying veneer to your substrate. So as we talked about, these have been cut down. You can tell that my substrate is slightly oversized, and that's kind of exactly what I want. I'll do this veneering on both faces, which whenever you're veneering something, it typically is the best practice for making sure that whatever your substrate is, it's got veneer balancing this. If I only veneer one face, depending on the adhesive I use, it's going to introduce moisture to only one face. That's going to cause it to cup or twist. If I am not using water-based adhesive, let's say I have epoxy, then it's just going to take longer for this material to absorb and release moisture. It's going to do it at a different rate on the face that is not veneered, so you really do need to have this stuff balanced. So I'm going to be veneering both faces. What I'll talk about doing here is not so much the application of adhesive on all this stuff or the clamping process, but keeping in mind how we're going to be gluing this thing down and what I need to do to prepare to have those pieces. So I'm going to use a vacuum bag for this. I feel like this is a small enough piece, it's pretty straightforward. I could just have two cauls or platens on both faces and then clamping these things down, and I would have enough pressure to get to where I want to be. The problem with this is a couple fold. If I were to put a platened top and bottom, this is good. If I were going to use hand clamps or screw clamps of some capacity, I would want to cut down this smaller platen just so I can get more access into clamps. The problem with this, though, is if I'm clamping between the 3/4 inch MDF, 3/4 inch material, 3/4 inch MDF, that's not a great deal of distribution of that pressure. So I'm right on top of where I need the pressure to be located between this platen and the veneer here. So what I think would be a safer option would be to stack up another platen here, another one at the bottom, another platen, and then I can distribute this pressure much more effectively. Get away with using fewer clamps, but the problem is it just takes so much of this material that I would have to waste or cut to this dimension. It just doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. And so I think the vacuum bag is probably the smartest way to go. Okay, so I'm going to have a bottom platen that is going to help to carry the glue up from here to my vacuum bag. And in the vacuum bag, I really don't need a platen on the bottom. I've also been told that, and I've seen woodworkers that don't use a platen on the top, and they just use the pressure from the vacuum bag on top. So the vacuum bag will suck in here. It might have some wrinkles, those concern me, but it will form to exactly the shape of your substrate or the piece we're going to be veneering to. And that's fine. I like the idea mentally of just having something that is dead flat, that is continuous all the way across, that will not have any voids in here like a ripple or a wrinkle. As that vacuum bag starts to pull down, there could be excess material there that could give some type of a gap between the glue pressure. So I don't like that. I prefer to have something here on the top for sure. On the bottom, there's going to be a platen inside the bag, and that's the piece that has the grid work to allow air to escape and flow. And I probably would be fine without using a platen on the bottom. The problem with this is if I have veneer top and bottom of this, as I try to load this into the bag, there's going to be the bag on top, the veneer could start to peel off on the bottom. As I'm threading this thing in there, I just don't want anything to catch or grab this veneer. And so for those reasons, I want to have something on the bottom, which is this piece, something on the top, and that will protect the veneer as it goes into the bag. I flip the switch, turn the bag on, and then I get even distribution of pressure. So that's what I'm going to be doing. Without putting on any adhesive, I'll show you what the setup here looks like. Right. So this is going to be the thing. I'm going to put my top platens, obviously on the top, roughly centered. Two things to notice. Number one is that there's a little bit of overhang on this platens all the way around, and that's okay. What's not okay is if there's a lot more overhang. What's going to happen as the vacuum bag starts to compress and suck pressure down, the more extension that I have on the length and the width, it's going to start to compress out here, and that means it's going to cause your platen, especially if it's a thinner piece, to have a starvation of pressure right here in the center. So if you imagine that this thing is going to create a shape based on being compressed down and making contact to these corners, you're just going to lose any pressure that's going to be here, and that just doesn't work for what we're doing. So cutting this slightly oversized is optimal. You can cut it the exact same size as whatever you're gluing to. The problem is just lining this platen to line up perfectly with your substrate. It becomes a bit tricky and problematic, especially if it's a larger piece, or if you have more than one part that you're gluing at the same time. So a little bit of overhang. It looks like I have about an inch extra on the length, an inch extra on the width, so I distribute that. It's about half an inch on either side. Anything that is 1 inch of extension or less is great. Once you breach that 1 inch or so, then it really starts to become problematic with having this thing start to form to the vacuum bag. The other thing to note is, if you'll notice these corners all around, I've got a couple of them floating around in this environment. These are vacuum bag killers. And so as this vacuum bag starts to compress, any of these corners that are left sharp are going to start to kill that vacuum bag and give you a little bit of a puncture. And that's all it takes for your vacuum bag to no longer be compressing the way it needs to be. So you'll notice with this one, I have got a little bit of inner tube material, so just rubber here, and as the vacuum bag starts to pull in and compress, this is going to distribute that pressure and not expose that sharp corner. So I can cover up all of those, I can get more rubber material for these corners, and I'm fine. The other thing you can do is just ease around these corners. I'm not so worried about the edges. It really is the corners that start to become a real nuisance for us. This is another example from a different vacuum bag experiment or project I was working on. But I just took this to the edge sander and eased all of these corners. As long as this face goes down, this is going to make contact with the vacuum bag itself. Then I should be just fine. What I don't want to do is put this in this orientation, because it's going to expose some of the corners, but it also is going to start to press down here, and it could start to give that belly or bulbous shape that we were talking about earlier. So there's a couple ways of doing this. It doesn't have to be pretty. I could take, let me get rid of this. I can take a round over bit with a router, and I can soften all of these, top and bottom, and that's great. If I were to use a thinner platens for the bottom piece, a 1/4 inch, even a 1/2 inch, really don't need to worry about rounding off those corners, just because if that vacuum bag starts to form and compress, it's less of an issue the thinner this material is. So that's what I would be doing for before I'm ready to load this into the vacuum bag. If I leave these in there, it's just too much of a risk. So I don't want to run this into harm's way when I could avoid it, and it's easy enough to fix. Then the last thing is going to be distribution of your adhesive. So what I don't want to do is get into a situation where I'm dumping out a bunch of glue here and then putting the veneer on top of that. I'm going to have a really heavy amount of thickness of adhesive here, maybe a little bit less here. It can only compress and distribute so much. So I want to make sure I lay down a nice even layer. And I have one of these glue rollers. Got this from a box store for a couple of bucks, and that was years ago, and I just use this over and over again. And I can start to use this to distribute the adhesive, and that is the easiest way, the cheapest way to get into it. I've seen other people use similar to like a V notch trowel, but not something made out of something that would oxidize or rust. But by setting up these notches, you can start to distribute the adhesive around, and then it's going to pull out into whatever the shape of those little notches are, but it distributes evenly. I guess that's okay. I see people make their own notch trowel tools. People talk about using credit cards. You can use thin piece of wood. It seems like a lot of effort, and this always guarantees that I get a nice even coating everywhere. So I'll do this way with a roller. I think it's a good investment to have one of those rollers, even if you don't have a container to leave it in, like this one. I can easily clean out this roller if it's a PVA glue, and then just reuse it again and again. The one adhesive that I would like to use for this application, though, is a cold press veneer glue. So it's a little bit thicker than just a regular PVA glue, white or yellow. So it doesn't have that bleed through situation that you could experience. Epoxy is notorious for kind of slipping through the pores underneath and then coming out through here. It doesn't happen all the time, but it always happens when you could least afford for it to happen. So anyway, cold press veneer glue is really great for doing this, and so I'll use that. I'll distribute this onto the veneer, and then the whole thing goes in the bag. Quick reminder here, I'll do that off camera, and then we'll pick up at the vacuum bag. I always want to distribute the adhesive just to the substrate. I never want to have this roller distributing on the veneer. This veneer is still fairly pliable, but it will start to pick up on that roller. So as I'm rolling this way, it will start to curl back, and it could curl this way, and it could start tearing up your veneer. So always just to the substrate, and then then your platens go on top, and then you're ready to start throwing it into the bag. All right, hope that helps.